So we have a committee quorum here, so Mr. Sesker, I think.
Yep. So
And Ms. Vivian and Mr. Zines.
for these mid-year budget reviews, we're looking at departments that have overspent their budgets 3 out of the past 5 years, or have budgets that are larger than $9 million. Among the questions that we asked the departments, we followed up on reconciliation list items, causes of potential overspending in FY16, and other questions. The first department up is the Department of Economic Development. The Department of Economic Development has overspent its budget for the last several years, and is on pace to do so again in FY16. And I just put a few notes in. You can see on the third page of your packet. In FY16, the second quarterly analysis projects a shortfall of $94,000. I would venture a guess that it'll be significantly larger than that. That budget shortfall does not include any of the $443,000 for the WorkSource Montgomery, which will obviously add a significant amount to that. In addition, there's the Quicken Loans Golf Tournament, which they're likely to spend $70,000 or so on in FY16 as well. Just on the fourth page, you can see there are some comments and follow-up on other budget items. The mobile ag lab is being implemented by the Office of Agriculture, the Maryland Agricultural Education Foundation, and the Montgomery County Public Schools. Based on my most recent conversations with OMB and with the Office of Agriculture, we're anticipating that will end up being fairly close to the $61,000 in total expenditures for FY16. The MBDC $50,000 additional dollars is not being spent. There are likely to be some savings, some underspending in MBDC in FY16 because MBDC is wrapping up its operations over the course of the next few weeks. In fact, at this point, 2 out of the 3 employees have stopped working, and 1 of the additional employees will be wrapping up shortly. The funding for workforce training scholarships, which the council added on the reconciliation list for FY16, that money was already sent to the Montgomery College, and DED and county government are looking forward to receiving a report regarding the results of that program. You can see there are a couple of additional notes in there. The $175,000 for federal lobbying contracts, which has been an add-on to the DED budget, funded through the year-end transfer for the last couple of years. In FY17 was moved to the operating budget of the Office of Intergovernmental Relations, which means that we won't need to have an annual expectation of an additional $175,000 being funded through the end-of-year transfer, even though it's an expense that everyone anticipates. With that, if there are any other questions about economic development, I'm happy to answer those. Otherwise, that's the status today.
Well, we do appreciate that they're in transition right now, and that there's costs associated with that, and everyone's trying to perform a seamless transition, but there's certainly cost to all of this. So let me ask my colleagues if there are any questions about this. Okay, keep going. Thanks.
For the Department of Recreation, the trends and year-end transfers are reflected in the table at the top of page 5 of your packet. For fiscal year 16, the department is projecting a surplus of about $500,000. The large majority of this is part of its approved savings plan. So council staff hasn't really identified any areas of concern. Of the items that council had added funding in the department, all of those have been implemented.
Okay.
My turn. Department of Permitting Services, although 5 years ago or so had essentially borrowed money from the general fund, they've been in a surplus position for the last 3 years. In fact, they've accumulated, by the end of FY16, they will have accumulated about $30 million in surplus over and above the 20% that they're required to do as operating as a sort of enterprise fund. We'll review a lot of that material when we get to the budget, but they have not been a draw and will not be a draw on the general fund for some time to come. The only
Well, yeah, and I think it's time to revisit some of their
Well-
assumptions, but we'll do that in the operating budget.
Right, and they have taken some steps to do that, and they will deliver the IGCC, the Green Building Fund, at a time when the council can take it up in May, so we can deal with it in June.
Yeah, this would not be a good moment in time. Okay, I don't think we have any questions, so thank you for the update, everybody. So, now we'll return to our, some hard work on zoning text amendments. I think Mr. Zients is teeing up some visuals here. So the first one up has to do with the Ripley South Silver Spring Overlay Zone standards.
Yes,
And Mr. Zients, could you take a minute and just fill us in on the history of this? 'Cause none of us were around for whatever started this debate, so.
I think I'm getting too old since I was at the
Which side
planning
were
board
you
at the beginning
on?
of this. Okay, I know I'm getting too old.
Okay.
This started with the recommendation of the Silver Spring Sector Plan to have an overlay zone for the Ripley Street South District. And I put up on the screen the lower part of that district that just deals with Newell Street. And the master plan itself was,
Excuse me, the overlay district is sort of that orangey area?
it's the grayish area, right?
Grayish orangey way.
Right. It's south of Newell Street, sort of east of Eastern Avenue, which is around where it says subject property on that map, and it's that whole grayish area over to that quadrant.
But it extends all the way over to Georgia.
And it extends to the other side
The
of
other
Georgia as well.
side, too.
Right. It's a relatively large area. The only area that we're concerned with, though, is around Newell Street, since the only amendment being proposed is to delete the word Newell Street from a restriction on height that says Newell Street and Eastern Avenue that confronts a residential zone in the District of Columbia is limited to height, da-da-da-da-da. So the ZTA itself would eliminate Newell Street. Now, the Silver Spring Sector Plan itself had somewhat...
Excuse me, so the issue is, technically, is whether the language, the maximum building height is 45 feet along Newell Street and Eastern Avenue that confronts a residential zone in the District of Columbia. Whether that confronts a residential zone in the District of Columbia applies to Newell Street. Is that the issue?
In a sense, yes. The technical amendment is only to delete Newell Street. And that exact phrase and was the subject of a circuit court determination that the phrase confronting residential zone in the District of Columbia really only applied to Eastern Avenue and did not apply to Newell Street, because in the court's opinion, confronting meant face-to-face, and since there's nothing on Newell Street that would face Eastern Avenue, they said that the zone as it was written did not confine that restriction to both Newell Street and Eastern Avenue. In the court's opinion, to do otherwise would have been to delete the word Newell Street, which is exactly what this ZTA would do.
So, Mr. Zients, were you down at the planning board when they wrote this language? Did you write this language?
I was not doing zoning at the time.
So you know nothing about that.
I don't have to, and
Was
I
it-
have to say, you know, the planner in me would have made this more clear. To say that, was the council's real concern the single family in the District of Columbia, or was it all residential property around? And did it really mean to affect Newell Street beyond that little piece that's at the corner of Newell Street and Eastern Avenue? But since the ZTA was, since the overlay zone was applied, there was a prior interpretation by the planning board concerning 8045 Newell Street, which is right where the property, where the Silver Spring South Overlay District, where the arrow is pointing. That property
part
it's
on the
pointing
corner
to is 8045 Newell Street. In that approval, the Park and Planning staff and the planning board determined that the restrictions on height applied all the way up Newell Street.
We've got a question, Councilmember Leventhal.
So that property you're discussing now is 45 feet tall?
No, it's only 45 feet for the first, what is it, 60 feet from the street. So beyond.
What height does it go to after that?
The back portion of that property is something like 85 feet.
When you see the back, you mean the part that's closer to Eastern Avenue?
Let me get a
On
point.
Kennett Street.
Let me get a pointer if I can.
Yeah, you have a little, here.
Oh, it's
there's a
85,
little
it's
buoy.
85 feet along Kennett Street.
You can have mine.
Okay.
And now, I can't,
There you go.
I can't. Well, you see this
That's-
area here
Yeah.
is, it's 70 feet to the, or 75 feet to the eave of the roof.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not sure the peak of the roof, so I'd suspect it would measure on the order of 85 feet. What the site plan said was back here, it was limited to 90 feet. So I have those two ways to deal with that.
If I can chime in, Rose Krasnow for the record. It's interesting that the planning board didn't consciously make any decision when that building on Kennett was decided, but the staff report clearly said that this meets the zoning code language, that it can't be taller than 45 feet close to Newell Street. So that was picked up. I mean, it was true. That building definitely adhered by that, but it wasn't something that anyone called out at the time, just when the staff.
Well, but according to Mr. Zions's memo, Mr. Cronenberg was an attorney for the planning board. He was a staff
No,
member?
he's a
he's
staff
staff.
member.
A planning board staff member.
Yes.
And he wrote that the overlay, this is the footnote, the overlay zone requires that building heights along Newell Street may not exceed 45 feet, and that was the planning board's judgment. They did not
Right,
ultimately allow
absolutely.
anything
There
higher
is-
than 45 feet.
there
It's-
is no
It's
question.
reasonable to think that the property owner might have wanted to build a taller building at that time, and the planning board said no because of the master plan language. Am I
Well, the only
correct?
place that would have restricted it is this area up here, right along Newell Street.
But am I incorrect in understanding that it is reasonable to presume that the property owner would have liked to have built a taller building and the planning board said no because of this master plan language at issue?
Well, I would have to go back and listen. My understanding was that the building as presented simply met that restriction, and so the staffer called it out because the building that the applicant had presented, in fact, complied with that language. No question that
On
staffer.
Newell Street and not beyond Newell Street. It's hard to imagine that a property owner would have built substantially shorter than he was able to. Presumably, the property owner interpreted the language in the master plan as limiting heights along Newell Street to 45 feet.
That is possible, but my point is simply that I don't really think it was ever a point of discussion in front of the board. It just was a statement in the staff report that indicated that the staffer
It
felt.
wasn't that issue. The
Right.
builder just complied with what appeared to be what the master plan said.
Yes.
And what about the buildings on the other side of Newell Street? How tall are they?
These are garden apartments I'm not sure the exact height. I think they might be 40 feet, something like that. They're three-story
Yeah,
gardens.
45 feet outside of the overlay zone. That's
Oh, that's not in the overlay
This,
zone.
right.
I understand.
Remember,
Okay.
that's why I pointed out the overlay. The overlay zone is this northern boundary of Newell Street, and everything on this side is in the district. All of the property on the other side of Newell Street is not in the district. That leaves really 4 properties inside the district. This is 8001 Newell Street, 8045 Newell Street, 8045 Kennett Street, which really fronts the other way, but, and there's the Acorn Park up
Well,
here.
on that last property, is that a new property?
Which one?
The last one, the one up at East West?
It was redeveloped with Discovery. It's relatively new,
That's the old Caldor building.
the old Caldor
Yeah,
building.
right. So is that 45 feet? Or what is that? Do we know?
I think it meets it here. It's not really
Not
tall.
that big. It's an odd place for that height to be an issue, which is what I find mysterious about this. Why would you take that view on East West Highway?
Well, and again, we actually believe that the language that talked about being across the street from the district really was only referring to that part of Newell Street, right where it
That
hits
was down there.
Eastern. And certainly that's the way we interpreted it when this case first came to us. And, you know, what's there right now is a self-storage facility, so even the building behind it, I'm not sure that they would have wanted to build any closer to the
So
self-storage.
you had interpreted that to just be an issue with respect to height across the street from the residential community, the single family.
The District of Columbia
On the
residential
District of
community,
Columbia
yes.
side. And that was how the planning board had interpreted this.
Well,
the
again, we believe at
beginning.
the time, yes, that
And
that is
then
how it was
there was
interpreted.
argument.
But the court disagreed, as Mr. Zients pointed out, and felt that the language on its face was clear.
Yeah,
So-
okay. All righty. Okay,
Right, well, I mean,
So the
I have
issue
little
is-
else to add, except,
Should we
you know,
change it?
although my memo described the property on the other side, it's not in the district. There are only these properties that do apply to the district. And, you know, although the court, through its interpretation, will try never to give an interpretation that excludes a word, in this case being Newell Street. The legislature can make that change if it so deems appropriate.
Mr. Zients, your memo does not recommend a yes or no vote on this zoning text amendment. Do you have a recommendation?
Can I claim that I'm not old enough to vote? I really thought there were equities on both sides here, that if I had started this before the approval of the building here, before the litigation with the prospect, before all of that started, I would have rewritten this, and I think the better policy as a matter of just planning is to look for the protection for these homes.
Yeah.
This area on this side
I'm
is
sorry,
urban.
wait, slow down. You would have thought that the better policy would not to have been to build at 90 feet adjacent to the 45-foot building? That the better planning policy would have been to have the 45 feet consistent?
No, I would have protected this area to the south here,
Yes.
and then allowed higher heights back there before the approval of this building and the litigation. But this building is there is the litigation there. I think there are competing interests on both sides. I mean, if you want, you know.
No, that's all right, that's fine.
The one issue we have here,
excuse me, for our good friends on the Board of Education, your meeting is on the 3rd floor. It's great to have you at the PHED Committee. We're delighted to have you join us. But Yeah. Okay, thanks for coming by. And if, you're welcome to stay. It's really, we're interested in the supplemental appropriation. I'm sorry.
The other issue that was raised was whether this was would be special legislation or not. And I've talked about this issue with the committee and the council before. If you want my opinion on that issue, I would rather do it in closed section rather than avoid your privilege that you have with my opinions. But as I understand it, you were going to get two opinions on that issue.
Let's get two opinions on this. In addition, Mr. Brown and Mr. Klein, you can each, what did we agree? I think I agreed that you can each have 5 minutes to argue about this. Mr. Brown, which side are you on? It's not special, or it is special? Because I've heard you on the subject before, and I know that you're an excellent attorney.
I think I'm the only attorney that you know that is successful.
You need to press the button there.
That has successfully challenged in circuit court a zoning text amendment as
But
special.
that wasn't my question.
Mr. Brown, for the benefit of those watching at home, you need to introduce yourself so that the
Sorry.
caption writer can explain.
Brown from Knopf and Brown.
Okay. No, I wanted to ask you which side of the issue you were on here.
Well, I'm on the side of not changing the law.
Okay. So, why don't we don't have Mr. Katz here. Do you have a timer, Mr. Zions?
I have a watch, yes.
Okay. You're on, Mr. Brown.
For how long?
5 minutes.
Okay.
Back in October of 2014, under your leadership, the council reduced the actual weight, the paper weight of the zoning code from 6 pounds down to 2 pounds. I don't think that you've gotten enough recognition as to what a tremendous accomplishment that was, and I want to publicly associate myself with that as one who has to go to the zoning code regularly. One of the reasons that code was so big was because of council members' receptiveness to special favor legislation to change this or that for one particular place or another. I'm not here today to argue that this would be special interest legislation. I can make a pretty good case that it is. Mr. Klein has made a pretty good case that it's not. Frankly, I doubt that I would have a client that has the resources to take up this challenge in court. The point I want to make is that you've done a tremendous job of slimming down the size of the zoning ordinance by 2/3. Let's not start going back in the other direction. There is no problem here that needs fixing. The statute is clear on its face. The opinion accompanying the statute, the zoning text amendment in 2000, basically mirrors the text of the law. The intention was to protect the edge of Newell Street and the edge of Eastern Avenue. And how do we know that that was the intention? When this issue first came up in 2012, when 8001 Newell Street brought its project before the planning board, Chair Francois Carrier asked team leader Glenn Krieger to come down to the hearing and give his opinion as to what the intention was in the sector plan. And he said unequivocally that the intention was to protect the edges both along Eastern Avenue and along Newell Street. And without any prompting, and he hadn't even been a part of the hearing before he came down cold, he said his recollection was that there were these apartment buildings across the street, and the thinking was that they needed protection along with Eastern Avenue. And when Judge McCallie got a hold of this thing, she said it made perfect sense for the phrase that confronts a residential zone in the District of Columbia to modify Eastern Avenue, because there are parts of Eastern Avenue that don't confront a residential zone in the District of Columbia. So essentially we have a perfectly clear match between the text of the statute, the text of the legislative opinion that accompanies the statute, which I've provided to you, and there is no ambiguity. The only problem is that there is language in the sector plan that talks about the overlay zone and mentions as among its major provisions that it protects the edge along Eastern Avenue, but it doesn't mention Newell Street. But that's not terribly surprising because that language was drafted earlier in 1999, whereas the actual zoning text amendment wasn't even introduced until October of 1999. So there's really no inconsistency in having a sector plan that mentions the anticipated major provisions but eliminates one of them. With the actual text of the bill, it's unambiguously clear, according to the judge's ruling. It was one that neither the applicant nor the planning board appealed to the Court of Special Appeals, where, once again, there would have been a rule of deference to the administrative interpretation of the agency that administers the act. So there really is no problem that needs fixing. And if, in fact, anyone thinks that perhaps this whole thing should be revisited, to my way of thinking, the proper time and place for doing that is when we come back to revisit the CBD sector plan again. Right now, it's 16 years old. I'm not sure where it is on the schedule, but if this area needs changing, that would be the time to do it. Right now, the applicant can build at 45 feet. I think a perfectly wonderful building could be built at 45 feet on this property, and there would be certainly no objection from my clients at 8045, who, of course, had to comply with the restriction.
That's time.
Okay. Well, that's a good 5 minutes. I will say, though, sir, you did not address the question, which was, is this special legislation or not? So I guess, Mr. Klang, you don't really need to say anything because it appears not to be an issue. So,
Thank you, but I'll use my 5 minutes anyway, if you don't
wanna-
mind.
Well, this was not supposed to be a rehashing of the issues. This was supposed to be on the subject that we asked you to address. So, Councilmember Elwood, did you have a question about this?
I have to go down to my other one. I just wanted to
Oh.
comment that, I've been following this, and I'm struck, by the language in the 1999 design guidelines, Silver Spring Central Business District, and it says, fairly plain as day, building heights along Newell Street, that's along Newell Street, and Eastern Avenue should ensure compatibility.
What page are you reading from, Mr. Elrich?
It's Circle 50. Should ensure compatibility with the adjacent residential neighborhood. At the property line, building heights should be limited to 45 feet. Now, this dash is in reference to the sentence above, which says along Newell Street. It doesn't say the corner of Newell Street. It says along Newell Street and Eastern Avenue. Above 45 feet, the building may step back 60 feet, and its height may increase to 90 feet. So I have been baffled how this ever got to see the light of day, because the master plans are pretty clear. Glenn Krieger was pretty clear. Mr. Cronenberg, who had no dog in the fight and just said, what's the zone say, says this is what it says. And all these people who worked in department planning and were part of this and pretty easily testified that it's 45 feet, then you step back 60 and you go to 90.
Mr. Cronenberg actually said two different things at two different times.
That's really bad.
Apparently, this is the problem that we're.
In 801 Newell Street, he said that that restriction did not apply further back along Newell Street.
I'll just say that when you've got a master plan in front of you, and it's as specific as saying along the street, I don't know how you get confused about what the interpretation is. If somebody wanted to say corner, they use the word corner. Along the street only has one meaning, and I think that, to do otherwise is just wrong here. And I agree, if you wanted to change things, change it in a
Well,
second.
I have a question about that, because it used to be, was this part of the plan that the council then approved? It used to be that the council would approve a plan, and then the planning staff there might be other things to implement the plan, but the council didn't actually see them. Because I know that we've made that change here. We've said, if someone says we're gonna do design guidelines, we say, well, we wanna see them. Do you know what
Well,
how that worked back, this was in 2000.
yeah, I know the overlay zone came after the plan's adoption, but I'm not sure the timing when. Greg, do you know?
Well,
Yeah,
the
This is
timing
probably
of
before
it.
your time, too.
No, but there's one other aspect of this that probably needs to be mentioned, and it's on your Circle 49, where it talks about the summary of the proposed Ripley South Silver Spring overlay zone, and under the major provisions, about halfway down on the page,
Yeah.
the second bullet mentions limit building height for new construction along Eastern Avenue fronting one-family detached dwellings in the District of Columbia as follows. And it deals with that language of the 45 feet, and then step back 60 feet, and the height may increase to 90. So, that seems to conflict with the other language if you just read them separately. But when you look in the overlay zone itself, the actual language there talks about Newell Street and Eastern Avenue and how they're to basically protect the single-family detached homes confronting that in the District of Columbia. So it got more specific when you got into the overlay zone language itself.
Okay, yeah.
So it,
That's part of the conflict. I have not, Mr. Brown had his 5 minutes of rehashing everything, so I guess I have to say to Mr.
Mr. Klein, and I'll keep it to less than that.
that you have the same right to go on.
Well, I'll just briefly say this. Jody Klein, representing those interests that would like to see the text amendment adopted. ZTA 1601 is intended to try and clarify the zoning ordinance, and you can see there is differences of opinion about how the zoning ordinance and the master plan should be interpreted. It surprises me that we're putting any weight on the testimony of Mr. Krieger at the planning board hearing on 8001, which basically was the project that got approved that brings all in, because his recommendations were overridden by the planning board then subsequently overridden by the circuit court, and now brought back before you with staff and planning board recommendation saying that we were right the first time. So you've got a record of your own staff in 2013, and now the staff report and the planning board recommendation saying that the intent of the council was to interpret it the way it was originally approved by the planning board, not by the court. And you can see that even the planning board has changed its mind twice. This text amendment straightens that out.
Well, it seems to be confusion. Councilmember Reamer and then Councilmember Leventhal.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Jeff if you could talk a little bit more about the competing equities issue that you mentioned. I mean, the fact is that that building has, can you go to the
I can go to shading diagrams.
satellite view?
Sure.
Hey, you want to use my pointer here?
No, nope, wrong way. These are shading diagrams. Well, let me go back. I'm sorry.
That one. If you want to make it, you can.
Thanks. It's hard to resist.
I know, it's kind of fun.
So that newer building has developed since, when did that newer one go in?
I think the approval was 2006.
Okay. I mean, so what jumps out to me is how do you put a building on this property in a way that has a reasonable impact on that adjacent building? I mean, it's troubling because
The other diagrams that I can show you and that the planning board looked at were shading diagrams from proposed taller buildings in that red circled area. So at maximum shade days, it would shade these buildings on the other side. North is going this way. So when the sun is about over here, it shades back that way, which happens in the PM. So there would be shading on this side. Not total, not complete, there would be shading. And of course, the taller the building you have here, the more the shading.
Yeah, I mean, if you put something up there, it's gonna be pretty tight. And, I don't know, that just, if I purchased a residence in that building, I understand why they feel like, it's a real diminution of what they paid for.
Okay.
But, anyway, I don't know, that's what I'm struggling with.
Councilmember Leventhal?
Mr. Klein, when did your client purchase this property?
8001.
That's the property that, let's not beat around the bush.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, which I think is labeled subject
It
property.
says subject property. right?
I'd have to check my file. I'm going to say
Well,
probably.
your client's here. Can you confer with your client and
I
answer your
can
question?
find out, yes, sir. Thank you, 1998.
Okay. Mr. Brown, did you represent Pat's Lawnmower Service?
On a pro bono basis, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the thing I have about this, not having been there, I mean, I understand the issue of the relationship across Eastern Avenue. So I understand why everyone would have said, okay, and I know over the years there've been all these issues as to how this all related.
With the district.
Yeah. But what I don't get is how you would really, from a planning statement, say that everything along Newell, all the way up to East-West Highway, would be subject to this. So where the Caldor, we think of it as Caldor, as old people, where that building is, I mean, under this interpretation, you would be saying to that property up there at the top that that was also subject to this constraint,
Right.
wouldn't you? And that
Yes.
doesn't make any sense at all.
But, Madam Chair, if I may, but it was built to 45 feet,
Well,
correct?
but that doesn't matter. It's nothing stays the same over the years. And if you think of, I mean, it's logical conclusion. Stuff happens, people have new ideas.
Well, that's why
things
master
not
plans are
done.
updated.
No, but property also changes its configuration over the years. So, I mean, from a planning perspective, and there are lots of anomalies, there are lots of places that are built to lower heights and they could be built, but that's a building that's been around for a while. And I don't know how anyone in their right mind would say that 45 feet up at East-West Highway in Newell makes any sense. And that's how the application of this issue would fall out, isn't that right?
Yes,
Am I
that is
wrong?
correct. That is correct. And also
So
when it
just
talks.
doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, I can see the argument if there was nothing else there maybe, but it's the whole road that this would apply to, right? All the way up.
Well, again, it would only apply to the first 60 feet.
Well, I know, but that's not an issue there. I mean, the only reason you'd have that setback issue is because you were dealing with buildings that weren't in the CBD, one way or the other. At least, I mean, I can see that as a legitimate planning objective. I mean, that's where I have a lot of trouble with this. Councilmember Leventhal?
Yeah, a couple more questions, if I may. Thank you. Does not the local map amendment process provide an opportunity for an applicant to correct errors in the zoning code or in the zoning map? If a property owner believes there's an error, is not the local map amendment route the way that errors are addressed? Am I incorrect about that?
If the error is on the zone itself, in this case, we're dealing with the text amendment, with the text of the zone, not the, nobody is saying.
So it's only if the zone is misclassified?
Correct.
Not if the
it's the wrong
descriptive
zone.
language in the floating zone, so this
Correct.
wouldn't apply. So
Correct.
a local map amendment would not be apt here. Okay. To the planning board staff, what is the plan for a South Silver Spring master plan? Will that be coming up in the foreseeable future?
We will be in front of you with a semi-annual on April 5th. We are showing that going forward, the timing, not starting right away, but if you approve it,
It's
it's
within
not
the
in
next
our
few
work
years.
program now. Yes,
It's within a foreseeable time horizon.
yes, it is.
Really? You got a few other things on your plate, too.
Okay, well, I'm going to state a position. I'm not going to support this ZTA. This is about as tough as any call that we've had to make here, and I don't really think what's at issue is the interpretation of the master plan language. I think what's at issue is whether a ZTA is the way that a property owner gets his grievances addressed when there's strong opposition. We've had, you know, I'm not a virgin. I've voted for ZTAs that were unlovely in the past, but generally where there was pretty overwhelming support for them, as in the, you know, or at least no vocal opposition, as in the case of Pat's Lawnmower Service, which was, you know, about as much of a red-headed Eskimo as any ZTA we've ever taken up here. Given that there is, you know, significant questions about how far along Newell Street this height restriction ought to apply and what really is our overall vision of South Silver Spring, and doesn't it make sense to concentrate more density as close as Metro as this property is, it seems to me those are not questions related to a ZTA, those are master plan questions. And happily, we have a South Silver Spring master plan on the near horizon, and that would provide a greater opportunity not only for the aggrieved and litigious next-door neighbors, but for everybody in the area to weigh in on what our vision is for South Silver Spring. So, you know, I don't know what, and it doesn't even matter, what the property owner thought was going to happen on this property when he purchased it in 1998. I don't know if he made the case for a higher height when the 1999 master plan was before us, but that would have been an opportunity to clarify. The lack of clarity would have been a problem for the property owner back then. But to try to correct it in this way when there's really stiff opposition, and it's very hard to dispute, I mean, as the slide says, we're talking about the subject property. And we know that the neighbors are already litigious. They've already taken this to court. So I think we're vulnerable on the question of spot zoning. And I think that we are acting in a manner that is cumbersome and complicated and controversial. There's alliterative. So, you know, I'm not going to say I will never, ever vote to add clutter to the new zoning code. Were you, Mr. Brown, in support of Meredith Welling's efforts to discredit the new zoning code, weren't you?
I had no association with that at all.
No? Okay, fair enough. But I did vote for Pat's Lawnmower Service, which, you know, certainly fails the test that you would put forward for us.
He didn't. He didn't say this was spot zoning. Here.
Well,
He
fine.
hasn't argued that.
No.
If
The
you-
point being that
if
we
you'll
shouldn't clutter
recall-
up. No, the point is that we've adopted this neat and clean, slim, new zoning code, and we shouldn't clutter it up again at the importuning of property owners, but we did indeed do that for Pat. But in any event, look, the South Silver Spring Master Plan is on the near horizon. We can have a broader conversation about the vision for South Silver Spring. We can talk about the Caldor building at that time. This doesn't feel good to me, and I don't want to vote for something that doesn't feel good to me. And I respect the property owner, but this is not personal. I mean, we have to determine whether we can stand up and defend our vote, and in this case, there are enough questions about it that it doesn't feel right to me, and I'm voting no.
Okay. Well, I beg to differ. I think, you know, as you alluded to, it's not just this. It is the Caldor building, and it's everything along the other properties along Newell, and there's a discrepancy. And it does remind me of why we wanted to look at the design guidelines, and if the planning board staff was going to come up with something for exactly this reason, that is a change that we have implemented over the years. So I think we need to fix this. It doesn't make any sense to say the Caldor building is subject to this restriction, which is the interpretation that apparently is advanced onto this poorly written, and everyone agrees there's a problem. I mean, our job is to solve these problems, so I'm okay with supporting the text amendment. So, Mr. Reamer, it's up to you. Once again.
It's a great committee.
It is. We're a team.
Listen, I'm not comfortable with this because I don't feel confident in what the outcome is, and
Well, the
like
outcome
George
is
said,
here.
Well,
This is it.
I mean the outcome in terms of what's going to happen on the ground, and I share many of George's concerns, and I think a master plan process would be a fine way to really be able to handle this in a proper way. So I also am not comfortable with this and won't
Okay,
support it.
fine. Well, Mr. Brown, we do appreciate your compliments on the rewritten zoning ordinance. So that was a good way to begin. Thank you. Okay, we're done with this one.
Okay. The next is,
You have to go?
I might, I have a sick kid, I don't know.
Okay, well, fine. The next one, we have gotten some concerns about this one, so this is just going to be a work session kind of thing. We're going to ask the planning board to comment on the Mr. Zions's suggestions here. So, just so you know, so we're not going to finalize our thinking on this. So, Mr. Zions, can you explain what the problem is? I'm sorry, Mr. Reamer has a child in need. All know how that is.
this ZTA stems from a provision in the current code that essentially says that once you subdivide a property, a tenant house and some other houses are counted toward density and the requirement to have TDRs. And TDRs and density are two separable things because there is agricultural zone land that has not severed its TDRs, it hasn't created TDRs, it is just bound by the dwelling units per acre density. If you've severed your TDRs, you have to have some sufficient number remaining to do additional building. And as the current code reads, any subdivision would require you to have retained TDRs and density for the tenant houses. Now, despite how clear I thought this read in the old code and the new code, the planning board had never seemed to interpret it that way. That when they were dealing with issues before them, and in particular subdivisions for development on land, they would not count the tenant houses as needing density or TDRs up until 2010, when they hit a subdivision that they said, wait a second, we could read the code. It seems clear to us that we've been doing this wrong, and therefore this is a subdivision, and therefore we will count the TDRs that are needed and the tenant houses to make sure that there are enough TDRs for each tenant house. That was somewhat of a surprise because even though the principal house and the tenant house were not disrupted, that is, the remainder form had the tenant houses, this applied. So with that 2010 recommendation, it created its own problems with some agricultural easement programs that people volunteered for. I'll mention there's 4 separable programs. The big ones are MALF and AEP. They both deal with the terms when a farmer is selling an easement to the county/state to keep that land in farming in perpetuity. As those easements were negotiated, there was a background assumption among both staff and the applicant that if you had a subdivision for child lots or a market unit that you were allowed to do, you did not have to retain the TDRs for the tenant houses. So comes now somebody who thought they had retained a right to build a child lot, and now under the new interpretation by the planning board, they didn't have enough TDRs to do that. Since they retained one, They had a principal, they retained one beyond their principal dwelling. They had one or more tenant houses. When they came in for that child lot, which Malf and AEP would have assumed that they could have, they could not because the interpretation was different. The ZTA as introduced would have addressed just that problem where there were easements that were sold. And it involved really 4 named easements that the planning board wanted us to name, and that's all okay. Having presented that limited amendment, the farming community said, wait a second, what about everybody else? Why is it wrong that if we retain the farmstead and the tenant houses that help that farmstead, and that is intact, what's wrong with a separable subdivision for which we had the rights to do it? So after some discussion, I tried to fully address that problem and make it more broad to address all situations, not just where there were outstanding easements. That is in the material you got today. The problem that I suggested in the memo was the potential for abuse. And this is in particular because we've gone through great extent to reduce rooftops that are possible in the ag reserves through the programs that we have. And this, in fact, would run counter to that. It would allow more rooftops under various conditions. So what I suggested, without unanimous agreement anywhere among any stakeholders in any part of the world, was that, number one, there be a covenant on this ground to put people on notice that, by the way, deeded subdivisions are illegal. Now, you think that may not be necessary or would be a tautology, but those who deal in the land transaction business think that would, in fact, put people on notice in the title record of a farm so that they wouldn't happen. And that is one of the main problems here, is that although we don't have a plat and a formal park and planning subdivision, that there are illegal deeded properties out there which cause problems both for landowners, for owners in the future, for when there are fires. There's a ton of problems that could cause. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is, again, something that's controlled when you do farm easements, is how many tenant houses you can have. As this was drafted, there is no limit, but AEP and MALF would have a limit of really what amounts to 1 for the first 200 acres of farm, and then 1 for every every 100 acres thereafter. That's really what those equate to. In any event, this memo has caused a fair bit of email this morning with a suggestion that the planning board review it with the sort of record I've laid out, some of the suggestions I've laid out, the hearing that where we heard from members of the farmer community that said what we first proposed was too narrow, and for the planning board to chew that over and come back to us.
So the idea, I mean, just in concept, is that in agricultural land, if I can just summarize as I understand it, in agricultural land, land that is devoted to farming, you can have a tenant house or a couple tenant houses.
There's no limit.
There's no limit to this idea, and they're defined as people involved in it, for housing for people supporting agricultural. So it's defined as an accessory building, right? Am I right?
It's
And so the issue became, if that, just for fun, say you have 100 acres, and you have, that's a farm with an accessory tenant house. If you were to subdivide that, and as you will recall, what is it, 25 acres? You can, that's, 25 acres is the lot size, permitted lot size in the agricultural zone, right? So, if it's 100 acres, and you had a farm, and you wanted to subdivide some portion of it off, say you could subdivide off 2 other lots of 25 acres each, right? And leave a 50-acre farm with an accessory building, or whatever, to support that farming activity.
Yes, I just wanted to add that the house itself, when it's built, we try still to keep it on a very small piece of land.
But however you were to achieve this, conceptually, you would have, under our rules, you have to have a TDR for every principal building, right? So the farmer would have to have one for say the existing farm, and then 50 acres, and then they'd have to have 2 others for the other 2 lots that would be created. Is that correct?
Too excessive.
No, if they were to subdivide it, so 100 acres, 50 acres associated with a farm, and then they subdivided off 2 other, 50% of it into 2 lots, say, just
I mean,
for
I think
simplification purposes.
Yes, I mean, the Barnesville Oak case
So
was,
I don't know about that case, and I don't want to know about that case. I just want to understand,
Can you continue? with
help
your-
people understand the issue. So 100 acres, right, divided in half, 1/2 stays farming with an accessory tenant house on it, and then you'd have 2 other lots. I know that's not exactly how it would play out, but conceptually, you'd have to have 3 TDRs, right? 1 for the main one, and then 1 each for the other 2 lots. I know it's not accurate simplification, but it is arguably accurate.
Right,
And the
but-
question is, do you need another, to be able to do that, do you need another TDR for the accessory tenant house?
Without amendment, yes.
You would need one because of how this is now.
Because it says any subdivision means you count the tenant house.
So that puts at risk, as far as I can tell, the ability of what's remaining to have a tenant house, which is an accessory use and supportive of what we like to think as agricultural functioning in the ag reserve, to put it in its most simplest terms. So I just wanted to say that for the record. Mr. Chris, did you want to join us on this conversation? Do you have any observations to add? Mr. Zients has tried with great effort to reflect the various views, and I think we know not everyone is always happy, and it's a newer solution that some folks haven't had a chance to react to, apparently.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, I'm Jeremy Chris, Agricultural Services Manager. I want to thank Jeff for the packet. I know that we've had a number of different versions of the ZTA over the past few weeks. I think the agricultural community supports what Jeff has outlined on page 3 of his memorandum for the added wording. A farm tenant dwelling is included in any density calculation if the farm tenant dwelling is subdivided in a different lot or parcel such that it no longer meets the definition of accessory use. I think the ag community would definitely have a challenge with Jeff's recommendation that he discussed today on page 4 of his memorandum. Second paragraph, staff would also recommend limiting the number of new tenant houses to some number related to the size of the farm, 1 tenant dwelling for the first 200 acres of land and 1 additional dwelling for every additional 100 acres in the farm parcel. You know, we really, none of us can predict the future. And one thing from where I sit, I see a number of new types of farming operations coming to the county that are more labor intensive. And if we're going to have a more labor intensive agricultural industry, we're going to need to address housing for the workers. So the definition right now for a farm tenant dwelling does say that you can have no more than 3 mobile double wide trailers. And that's helpful in the definition, the current definition of the farm tenant dwelling. So if we restrict the number of farm tenant dwellings,
Excuse me,
future.
Mr. Durso, 3rd floor. We're glad to have you, but we've been shooing the whole Board of Education down to the 3rd floor. Sorry.
So obviously, we're going to have another opportunity to discuss this here when it comes back from the planning board, but I just think that, we need to recognize that flexibility is important for agriculture. Agriculture is going.
Mike, your meeting
The
is on the 3rd floor.
Education Committee is meeting on the 3rd floor.
I
Yeah.
wasn't just, we weren't just welcoming you. We were really trying to be your concierge.
That's why we're still dealing with the achievement gap.
Always good to have some levity here. So you
So in
have some
conclusion, I
concerns
think
with
the
this.
conversation is a little better now than it was on the 23rd of February. We are talking about the need for future tenant dwellings. I just would caution that we put a restriction on the number. And I wouldn't recommend that we have a standard in our zoning that's more restrictive than the standard that's in an easement document, the terms and conditions of an easement. So, but anyway, I think that's enough for now.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Leventhal?
This is a difficult meeting. I found that Ripley Street issue very difficult, and I think this is difficult. I feel sort of like I'm being treated as an afterthought here. I mean, I have very good relations, I think, with our agricultural community, but no one has explained this to me. So the council president introduced it, as is her right. The hearing, as Jeremy alluded to, overwhelmingly negative. I mean, the witnesses did not like this ZTA. Then I happened by chance to be walking through the front of the 6th floor, and Jeremy and Bob Sissel and several others, Jimmy Clifford, were there. They said, well, we've worked it all out. Well, I didn't know what had been worked out, and I guess is what they worked out what Mr. Zients is recommending. I feel like, and then Jeremy just now alluded to, well, I guess it'll go back to the planning board, and so we can discuss it again. Nobody's made that decision.
Well,
So
I
feel
said
like there's been
I said at the beginning that this is just a work session, that we've had requests from the community to send it back to the planning board, and that's what we're going to do to get their input on this. I did say that at the beginning of the session.
Okay, so I'll reserve comments until the planning board sends it back. I'm not sure why we're here. That's fine. Let's send it back to the planning board.
Well,
Fine.
as you observe, it is complicated, and it's because of the different points of view. It seemed worthwhile to at least lay out the issues so council members got introduced to it and had a chance to ask questions.
Well, okay, what is the problem we're trying to solve?
If I can chime in, when Mr. Clifford originally brought this to our attention, the problem was that because the interpretation of whether you needed a TDR for a tenant dwelling unit had changed, we really found ourselves in a situation where even existing tenant dwellings suddenly weren't legal. They did not have a TDR. They were not required to have a TDR. That's what started this whole thing. And even someone who was about to build one, when we went to the one house per 25 acres, we encouraged people, if they were going to sell their TDRs, to keep one for the main unit, but said that you didn't need them for these tenant units. So they did just what we said. They kept one, and now they need a farm place, a tenant dwelling, and they don't have any TDRs left. So or they have one that is now illegal because it didn't have a TDR on it. So he was trying to address that specific problem. Once it came forward in discussion, I think that the farming community got concerned because tenant dwellings are very important to them, and they wanted to be sure not that just ones that are standing now are protected, but going forward they still wanted to be able to subdivide their land, but to be able to keep tenant dwellings. So it got much more complicated than when it was first brought to us, which is why I think that the suggestion has been made that it come back to the planning board for consideration.
And what about the dates? I recollect at the public hearing on February 23rd, the dates in the ZTA were a subject of concern. They're still in the matter that's before us now.
The dates would have meant that you had to have an existing easement to take advantage of this flexibility. It really provided for existing tenant houses and didn't allow future tenant houses, and it tried to cure just the problem in the past, if you will, by these older easements.
Is that the sponsor's understanding, Madam Chair? Is that what you intended? That you were reaching back to legalize things that were already on the ground? Was that your intent originally?
Well, the issue was to address, to a large degree, as you know, there are discrete situations out there. And what the public testimony brought out is that there are a lot of other ones that are related to that. Not quite exactly in the same situation, but similar enough so that they would be negatively affected. So the world, that's the point of public hearing. You find out all the other issues that are associated with these things. It's also brought out apparently an issue of misbehavior. There apparently are units being constructed or that exist that are not accessory to the main building.
That are not for tenants?
Apparently not.
And
so
how would this address that problem?
Well, that remains an issue for enforcement because, and that is part of the challenge as to how this is managed going forward. But these are issues. So, we're trying to push our agricultural community into a new way, into being responsive to the community, all this grow local stuff, all this trying new initiatives for supporting our agriculture on smaller properties. If you will recall, there's been a big push for new ways of growing interesting things on smaller land. There's been quite a economic development initiative under Mr. Chris and the Department of Economic Development, but that also, as was indicated earlier, can be done, needs a lot of people. And the question is the support for those operations in the agricultural community. So there's a belief, and you can ask the other folks here, as to whether they think they continue to need farm tenant houses, and I think the answer is yes. And that is part of the challenge. So some of it's legitimate and some of it's not. There's always that. We had this conversation the other day with respect to, frankly, Airbnb. Hundreds of people are doing it.
Well, yeah, let's
Is
not
it
talk.
not?
That's
Well,
a
I
different
know,
issue.
but it's always the issue of it's not perfect.
Okay, now what is...
So anyways, that's kind of the issue in front of us. And again, this is an airing of the background of it and a conversation about it.
Mr. Zients, what does the bed and breakfast issue have to do with any of this?
Separable, nothing.
So you're trying to solve a different problem with the bed and breakfast issue?
The bed and breakfast idea here is that it's already limited to being in the principal dwelling. It has to be owner occupied to be a bed and breakfast. The only owner can be in the principal dwelling. It can't own a tenant house, then it's not a tenant house. The fact that it was already attached means it would never be counted as a separable unit. So
say that again, please.
The definition of bed and breakfast in the AR zone is that is that it's in the owner-occupied unit. It has to be part of the owner-occupied unit. The only owner-occupied unit can be the principal dwelling, not a tenant house. So you
Bed and
would,
breakfast has to be in the building that is occupied by the owner of the building.
correct.
Okay? And so you're trying to solve completely unrelated problems in one ZTA.
Well, it really, it's a non sequitur to have it there. It would never be counted.
There's
as
no
a-
reason why you would have to cash in a TDR to build a bed and breakfast. It doesn't matter, so.
In your principal dwelling, you would never need it. It would already, you would
So bed and
always-
breakfast shouldn't be,
Exactly.
there's no need to clarify that a development right is not required.
Right, I
We
would.
are trying to solve two problems in one ZTA.
Well, I would, my recommendation was just to delete bed and breakfast to not have the confusion anywhere.
Originally,
I'm sorry, so in other words, you drafted this, so the council president responded to a concern from the agricultural community that there were existing tenant buildings that were non-conforming, that had not resulted from the cashing in of a TDR. And in the drafting of that, you came upon line D, B, D, and said, oh, let's solve this too. Let's get rid of that also.
Correct.
It was just an opportunity to clean up something in the code that you thought was
Yes.
anomalous. And now you're proposing to drop that idea because it's confusing.
Forgive me, my mind wandered a little bit. I thought you were getting back to Airbnb and.
No,
those-
we're not talking about Airbnb.
I
That's a
know.
very complex topic. Let's not bring that up.
That's what I thought I was trying not to bring up.
Well, but your
My-
memo, Jeff, you've got paragraph, look, I've got no knowledge of this. No one, friends, has briefed me on this, my good friends in the agricultural community. No one has asked for my time on my schedule. No one has said, George, we've got an issue. No one has explained this to me. Okay? So, if you expect me to cast an informed vote, call me maybe, okay? Because I don't know what's going on. We had a public hearing, overwhelmingly negative. Witnesses did not like this ZTA. Then some other language was worked out by some agreement. I don't know what it is. I guess it's reflected in Jeff's recommendations to us. I don't understand them very well. That has resulted in a torrent of email over the weekend saying, oh my God, 16.2 is terrible, but it's a different group of people saying it's terrible from the ones who said so at the public hearing. That brings us to today. I do get the concept that if it is necessary to house your workers on a farm, because otherwise you can't farm, then you should not extinguish that right just because you sold some TDRs, because you need the tenants to live on the farm. I understand that, but I don't understand I don't understand this ZTA that's before us, and I don't understand how a lot of things seem to have been worked out when I've never raised my hand and voted on anything. And I don't understand exactly what gave rise to this ZTA. What is the, I don't, the planning department was about to describe a specific property, and the chair said, we don't want to talk about that. But these things only ever arise because a specific property owner says, I've got a problem. But if that's not germane to this conversation, and if we're just going to shelve the whole thing and say, planning board, figure it out, and bring the stakeholders together like we did with the child lots issue, then again, I don't know even what we're doing here now. Let's just send it back to the planning board and adjourn the meeting. I've got other work to do.
Well,
Councilmember Leventhal,
the
I would like
point
to
of
take
this is to
responsibility.
help council members understand the background, which is in the memo,
I've read them.
and to at least be appreciative of the issue. But the proposal is not to not do this, it's to get the planning board's comments on this solution, or perhaps there's another one. That's the point. Not to,
Councilmember
like,
Leventhal, I'd
not
like to
continue the
apologize
conversation.
for you and I not having a one-on-one. Same thing with you, Councilmember Reamer. The circumstances as to how this came forward, it didn't originate from the agricultural community, but the ag community is now at the table. So I think we do have some time now for us to give you the kind of background that you should have had prior to today, so I apologize for that. And so There are some recommendations here that are helpful. There's some things we still need to discuss, and so how about if we schedule some time to discuss those things?
Okay?
So we're going to shelve the whole thing for today. Which is
As
what I would recommend, yeah.
As I said, this is
Seems
just a work session.
not ready for
to
prime time.
Talk about it and get briefed on the issues. Councilmember Reamer, did you have
No,
something?
I think I can wait for the next step in the process.
But, you know, this is the time, if you have other questions about this, you know, that's what this is for. Okay, I think we've done enough for today. Thank you, everybody.